Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome, and today we're talking to James Paterson, who is a Liberal Senator for Victoria, and he's the chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. Thank you for joining us on Afternoon Light podcast, James.
Thank you for having me, Georgina. It's great to be here at the Menzies Institute.
It's great to have you, and I was thrilled to show you around our beautiful exhibition space and all we've been able to accomplish in exactly a year. In 2 days is our 1 year anniversary of being incorporated. So
it's amazing what you've been able to achieve in such a short time, and it's, as you know, so overdue. It's so great to see Robert Menzies' life and achievements being recognised and celebrated as it should be.
Yeah, and here on campus too, at his alma mater, and yours, and mine.
That's right.
We're all very happy here. Happy to be back. James, I wanted to start our discussion today by asking you if you could paint a picture of the geopolitical environment that Australia faces, and which obviously must come up day to day in your committee work. But you've recently been to London, New York, and DC, talking with our AUKUS partners. So you no doubt have some fascinating insights from those discussions too about what Australia's facing.
The Prime Minister's used the phrase to explain our newfound strategic environment that we're living in the most uncertain times since the 1930s. And that's not just a global story, which we've all seen in Ukraine, the largest ground war in Europe since World War II, but it's a regional story as well. And it's principally been driven by the changing posture of China towards the world, and particularly its own backyard. We've seen how it has militarised disputed features in the South China Sea, how it has abrogated the freedoms of the people of Hong Kong, and it's cracked down at home on Uyghurs and other dissidents. But we've also seen the way which it's changed its posture towards Australia. A decade ago, Australia and China had what was really a arrangement of convenience, a mutually beneficial relationship where it was based on a transactional trading relationship. And that has changed to what really we see today as much more of a clash of systems, where the Chinese system is trying to coerce the Australian system. It doesn't respect us as an individual sovereign liberal democracy, and it thinks that it can use its trade with us as a tool of leverage or coercion to require us to make changes to our domestic public policy settings. And the clearest evidence we have of how much things have changed is, in 2014, the Abbott government secured the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and Xi Jinping addressed a joint sitting of the Australian Parliament. And last year, China published its list of 14 grievances where it said that we had to change various things about our domestic legal system and political system in order to get them to stop economically coercing us using their trade leverage. So it really is a changing time, and we have to change to respond to it.
Yeah, I remember being in Parliament when the chapter was signed, and there was, a lot of backslapping, a lot of cheer, a lot of optimism, and who would have thought in very few years that things had completely and utterly changed. But I think when we look back on the sort of long-term trajectory, it was all very foreseeable, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's a really interesting debate in academic circles about whether or not Xi Jinping represents continuity or whether he represents change in the Chinese system. I think the best sources suggest that he is much more continuity than he is change, and perhaps is an accelerant that has driven these changes faster and more aggressively, but they were always on this trajectory. Rush Doshi, who's a former academic who's now Joe Biden's China advisor at the National Security Council, has published a book called The Long Game last year, which really sets this out very persuasively. And he goes back to the history of the phrase hide and bide, which was a philosophy first articulated by Deng Xiaoping. And it's hide your talents and bide your time, which is essentially that China should be meek and humble and not confront the world while it is weak, but when it becomes strong, it will be able to assert itself. And I think we should have known as long as 40 years ago that was the trajectory that China was on, and it's just manifesting the way it was always going to.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I I think we have been naive, unfortunately, in Australia. And part of the problem has been, of course, we are a free country. We're a liberal democracy. So we have been open and wanting to be open to our neighbours, our trading partners, to the diaspora that has moved here. And that is what makes Australia the great country that it is. But it's also left us very, very open to being taken advantage of.
I think naive is the only fair description for Australian policy 5 to 10 years ago and before that. And it might have been naive with good intentions, but it still has costs and consequences for our country. The one thing we can take pride upon, though, is that we have woken up to this challenge much earlier than most of the rest of the world has. And really we set out on a path 5 years ago to address the weaknesses that we have and to harden ourselves, particularly against these grey zone threats to our sovereignty, things that fall short of the threshold of war but are still compromising, and that includes economic coercion and cyber attacks, but also espionage and foreign interference. And we have really led the world, particularly the legislative powers that we've given our intelligence and security agencies to combat that. So much so that on my trip in the United Kingdom, they were very interested in knowing how they could essentially copy what we have done and how they could replicate what we've done, because they don't have the same powers and a legal architecture that we've put in place, which has been quite successful in confronting that threat.
Yeah, indeed. Well, Tony Abbott described the relationship, as you I'm sure will well remember, relationship with China as one of fear and greed. It makes me think too of the EU's relationship with Russia, that there has been a little bit of fear, probably not enough fear, but there's been a huge amount of greed when it comes to using Russian oil and energy exports, and of course the investments that have come in from all the oligarchs into the EU and Britain as well. It's interesting to see those parallels. Of course, the EU and Britain haven't been touched as much as we have by China. Geography is first and foremost the reason for that. But how do you see the parallels there with the what the EU is now experiencing with China? And I guess sort of thinking about what Australia has experienced over the last few years, where we have been the victim of these trade embargoes by China as punishment for our response to Chinese interference in Australia. We've ended up saying, well, we maybe could just be a bit less greedy and put up with a bit of economic pain in order to stand for our principles. Is that what we're seeing in the EU and Britain?
Absolutely. I mean, they have had a dramatic wake-up call, even more dramatic than the wake-up calls that we have had, because it's been kinetic, hard military conflict, not just grey zone coercion. But both of our systems have been jolted into accepting the reality of the environment that we're in, that we probably should have recognised and adapted to earlier and could have seen the signs of, but sometimes it requires dramatic events to get political change. And Europe is going through nothing less than a massive sea change of security policy when you've got countries like Finland and Sweden joining or applying to join NATO, when you've got Germany announcing a doubling of its defence budget, when you have countries like Switzerland coming off the fence and no longer being neutral when it comes to applying sanctions. These are massive changes, and I think really welcome ones. I mean, there's nothing positive about the conflict in Ukraine, but if there is any solace that we can take from it, it is that it has woken up Europe in the same way Australia had on China, and it is now allowing them to understand better what we have been saying about China, and they can now see the connections between Russia and China more clearly, and that actually what we're facing is a common challenge of authoritarianism and rising authoritarianism, and that we need to meet that challenge together and in a united way, and that's our best chance of prevailing, because collectively we actually exercise a lot of strength.
Absolutely. Well, not just military strength, economic strength. So James, this idea that liberal democracies, because I think the use of the term West has its problems because we're talking about India, although again some problems with Russia, but liberal democracies confronting authoritarian regimes. Is this a new Cold War, do you think? I mean, it's been the debate of commentators and academics alike.
Yeah, history can be a bit of a straitjacket in that way. And if you say it is a new Cold War, then it's a term which is laden with so much meaning and so much history. So it's not a really a useful one. Other people have called it a hot peace as a kind of a variation of that, in that we are seeing almost what you would call proxy conflicts and proxy contests around the world, not as direct as as anything we saw in the Cold War, like Vietnam or the Korean conflicts, but things which might amount to what is a pre-conflict period, what is amounting to be a conflict period. And I'm referring obviously to the Solomon Islands in particular, where those who understand their history and understand the history of the war in the Pacific in particular will immediately recognise why it's detrimental to Australia's interest to have a permanent Chinese military presence in the South Pacific. We take very seriously the assurances that Prime Minister Sogavare has given us and the region and his own people that there will not be a formal Chinese military base or a permanent presence there, but that's clearly China's ambition, and we have to be alert to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was incredibly concerning to hear that news over the last few days, but the lead up to it as well. Just thinking about what's going on here in Australia domestically, and we're sitting here at Melbourne University campus. They've been challenged over the last few years with allegations of foreign interference and the like. How do you see that, particularly in your as chair of the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security? How do you see that playing out on our campuses, and what can we do about it?
Yeah. Well, happily we have a plan. The PJCS just concluded a report a few weeks ago on the national security risks in higher education. We made 27 recommendations, both to universities and to the government, about things they need to do. And frankly, they need to address what are systemic weaknesses and vulnerabilities that are some inherent in the nature of the university system, in their openness and their outward looking on the world, which we don't want to dissuade them from. That's important, but they have to be much more sophisticated and much more cynical, frankly, about some of their international engagement. That's both relates to their dependence on the international student income and the compromises that has produced, but also their research cooperation arrangements with universities in authoritarian political systems, and China is the biggest one that's relevant for the Australian university context. Some progress has been made over the last 5 years with the University's Foreign Interference Task Force, but the committee is concerned that not enough progress has been made and vulnerabilities remain, and that the universities need to do this not just because it's in the national interest and because it supports our national security, but because it's consistent with their values. They shouldn't allow their academics to be silenced out of fear of consequences of international student income being lost. They shouldn't allow students to be spied upon and intimidated for being outspoken in class if they're an international student from China. They shouldn't allow Confucius institutes to intimidate people on campus. And these are really important things which go to the core of it, their identity as open institutions in the West.
So picking up on your comment about international universities being reliant on international students and that then compromising some of the decisions that they make, do you think that the universities in Australia need to reassess their business model? I mean, they've kind of been forced to with the COVID-19 pandemic and basically the international students disappeared overnight. And you can feel it here still on campus at Melbourne. There's very few international students around compared to before, and you query how many come back, and if they do come back, they're not probably coming back from China.
Yeah. Yes, I do think the universities need to reassess their business model, because they have made a series of choices over the last couple of decades that have brought them to this position, and they could have made different choices in the past. Many of them went very big and made a very big bet on the international student market, and many of them have built great buildings and taken out great loans and acquired masses of property and hired lots of staff based on that bet, and there was risks always inherent in that bet. There are risks that are reputational and go to the university's reputation, but also there are financial risks that some of them are overexposed to just one or two destination markets, and that was an irresponsible thing for them to do, and they're going to have to unwind that and look for other ways to fund their research in particular. That includes working more closely with the private sector and the commercial world as they do in other countries. That includes raising more money from their alumni and generating endowments to support those things. It doesn't all have to be funded by students, and it doesn't all have to be funded by the government either. There's lots of options available for universities.
Well, and the private sector's had to respond too. I mean, you think of companies like Treasury Wine Estates. A huge portion of their exports went to China, stopped overnight with the tariffs placed on Australian bottled wine going into China. They've had to find new markets, and they've had to make very tough decisions, and it's been a bad time for their shareholders. But they're a private company. They're not a government-owned company. They're publicly listed, but they they adjust. That's the grim reality of the times we live in.
Exactly right. Diversification is something that everyone has to do, whether they like it or not, in their own financial interests. And the government shouldn't have to force a university or any other institution to do that. They should see that as in their own interests.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been a very tough lesson for the universities, and I mean, COVID-19 notwithstanding, it's been a tough lesson over the last few years that you do need to diversify your student numbers, but you also, I think, need to get back to the principle that these universities are Australian universities and they should be first and foremost, therefore, the education of Australian young people.
That is why we give universities billions of dollars in taxpayers' money. That is the reason why we fund them.
And it's a good thing. It's a good thing. We want an educated country. We want educated young people to go and do marvellous things. But let's hope that the Australian students come first.
Yeah.
Now, James, you were in London and New York and Washington DC the other day. In fact, I saw you through the crowds at the airport. We both made it overseas. I think for your first time since COVID.
It was,
it's very
absolutely.
exciting to get back on a plane.
Indeed.
But you were there as part of a committee delegation of AUKUS partners to discuss this fantastic initiative that the government has been involved in. Can you tell me how AUKUS came about and why it's so important?
Yeah, I mean, my view is that AUKUS is our most significant international security arrangement since ANZUS. It sits alongside an architecture of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing relationship, the Quad partnership, our bilateral strategic partnership with ASEAN as a really significant foreign policy achievement of Australia. And I think it will go down as one of this Prime Minister's greatest achievements in the same way that ANZUS goes down as one of the greatest achievements of Robert Menzies. How it came about is that the United States has never shared its most sensitive nuclear propulsion technology with any other country in the world except Great Britain, which they did in 1958. Others have asked and have been told no in the past. But our Prime Minister had the vision to seize the moment of the changed strategic environment and seek this support through the UK and the United States, and they agreed because they recognised that in many ways Australia is on the front line of the contest of this century, which will be won or lost in the Indo-Pacific. And what is at stake is nothing less than the future, that world that our children and grandchildren will inherit from us. Will they live in a free world as we have, and will they enjoy prosperity and peace as we have? And in order for us to meet that challenge, we have to be equipped for it. We have to have the capability for it. And our objective is to deter conflict, to prevent it. And for deterrence, you need two things. You need capability and you need intent. And AUKUS delivers both. Capability through the sensitive military technology we'll acquire, not just nuclear submarines, but a lot more in the short term with precision-guided munitions and hypersonic missiles and cyber warfare capabilities, quantum computing, AI, and eventually the submarines. That provides that capability, but it also is a signal of intent. It's a signal of commitment from the UK and the US to our security, and it's a signal of our commitment to defending our shared values and our shared interest in the region and upholding the sovereignty of all states, whether they're part of AUKUS or the Quad or whether they're not.
And I think something that is perhaps lost in some of the commentary on AUKUS is the importance of the UK and the US focusing on our region, because without a strong, particularly US presence, we are left extremely exposed, and we can't rely on that necessarily. And we've had ANZUS for now 71 years almost, and we have had a strong US presence in our region, but with ebbs and flows of what is popular with the US public, with the predilections of various US presidents, how do we make sure that the US remains engaged and invested in our region, in the Indo-Pacific, not just in the Eastern Pacific, which is, of course, of interest to them, but that is incredibly important, I think, from an Australian strategic perspective, is that we have not just the US but the UK reinvesting big time in our region.
The beautiful thing about AUKUS is that it both increases Australia's self-sufficiency and our ability to defend ourselves and incentivises our partners to continue to take an interest in the region and to support us. It means that if anything ever did happen that prevented them from coming to our aid, we would be better equipped to defend ourselves, but it also demonstrates to them why they should be invested in the region, because they have good friends here who want to uphold the rules-based order that we've all prospered under. And it's not just Australia, it's Japan and South Korea and Singapore and India India and others who are really invested in that, the Philippines. And this is a real mechanism to deliver that US investment and long-term commitment. And it's a real signal from them that they intend to be a Pacific power for the long term, that they are not going to abandon their interest in the Pacific. In fact, they're increasing it under successive administrations. The Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration have all had different but consistent increased commitments to this region because they recognise that's where the contest is. So I'm very heartened by it, and I think Australians should be comforted by it.
But how do you think Russia's invasion of Ukraine has changed things from the US perspective? Do you think that diverts US attention back to Europe and away from the Indo-Pacific, or do you think the US is able to walk and chew gum at the same time? Because that it has been a criticism in the past. There's been confrontations in the Middle East. They forget South China Sea. They allow China on their watch to build up military installations in the South China Sea. They adopt a policy of strategic patience with North Korea, and North Korea goes on to test ballistic missile after ballistic missile, build up its nuclear program. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think serious Russia watchers were not surprised, but I feel like the general sort of international community of geopolitical watchers were a little bit taken aback, and it certainly went against what a lot of the predictions were being made in January, early February. Are we going to see a US that steps a bit away from the Indo-Pacific because of that?
There's no doubt that Russia is a very serious short and probably medium-term distraction for the US, and that it does demand their attention because of their commitments under NATO to their partners, which they take very seriously, as they should. But I'm hopeful that it won't be a long-term distraction for two reasons. One, Europe is stepping up in a way it never has before to meet its own security needs, and the expansion of NATO and the increased investment of NATO partners in their own defence is a very welcome thing, because that will take a load off the United States, and it will allow Europe to have a more leading role in its own defence, as it should. And it's also brought Europe's attention to the Indo-Pacific and made them realise the way in which they have a really strong interest in our security as well. But I think it's also worth remembering that in the scheme of things, Russia has a similar GDP to Australia. It's a declining power, not a rising one. And I think everyone recognises that the long-term contest is not going to be between the United States and Russia. It's going to be between the United States and all of its allies and China. And if China continues to have its aggressive posture towards the world, which we'd assume that it will under its leadership for some time, then that is where our attention needs to be. And that was a very consistent message we got while we were in the United States. It's also the message we got while we were in the United Kingdom. And there seems to be a pretty strong consensus being forged there in both countries across the aisle in a bipartisan way, and that's very welcome.
Well, that's interesting to hear that was the reception you got in the UK, because I certainly noticed when I was in London, watching the BBC, the coverage of Ukraine, it was just wall to wall. Nothing else was happening in the world except for Ukraine, which was appropriate. It's very close geographically, and they would have pretty significant people-to-people links. But it is reassuring that there is not a diversion of focus from the importance of the Indo-Pacific and the threat of authoritarian China. I wanted to ask, though, James, about the ability of Australia and the UK and the US and other partners to build support for taking a tougher stance against China's coercion amongst our region, and in particular Southeast Asian and South Pacific neighbours. There really has been a bit of neutrality or a bit of hedging, particularly in ASEAN states. And it troubles me how we're going to overcome that, because I think it's all very well for Australia to join together with our natural partners, our traditional partners of the US and the UK, and it's great that we have the Quad starting to develop. It sort of fits and starts with Japan and India as well, but Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia particularly. How do we get countries like that to understand the urgency and imperative of standing up to China's coercion?
I think a lot of those countries do understand that, but sometimes feel that they don't have enough options, enough choices available. And it's a task of us and our allies, led by the United States, to provide those options. And they're options beyond security and diplomacy, but also economic engagement. There's nothing that Southeast Asian nations would value more than better access to the US domestic market from a trade point of view. They have great US investment in their countries. They have very generous aid programs, they have great military engagement, but a missing piece of the puzzle is that economic engagement, and we'd really welcome that. And the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership was one opportunity to do that, and domestic politics in the US has kind of vetoed that. But we hope that there are other opportunities, and the Biden administration is talking about other options to provide that for them, because we don't want any country to feel that the only partner of choice for economic engagement and growth is China. That would be a very bad thing. And we believe what we say when we say that we believe in sovereignty and self-determination, unlike others who kind of pay lip service to that. We're genuine about it. It is up to them to choose the path for themselves. We just want to make sure that they have good options on the table that they can take up. And I'm confident that they will, because ultimately I think countries want their sovereignty respected, and they want to partner with countries that respect them genuinely and operate within a rule of law framework and are trusted and open and transparent. They don't want to be coerced by a bully in the region, and they will choose that if we provide it to them.
How do you think then it plays out in the Pacific, particularly the South Pacific? It's where Australia's the key player.
Yeah.
We've taken a real leadership role in terms of development assistance, in terms of security assistance when countries have asked for it. And the announcements over the last few days, I mean, Penny Wong, Labor's spokesperson for Foreign Affairs, has said it was the greatest foreign policy failure of an Australian government since the Second World War that Solomon Islands signed a security agreement with China. I mean, it's big call. Call.
It's quite
we're in an election campaign. I appreciate that.
It's quite an irresponsible thing for Penny Wong to say. I don't know whether she's had classified security briefings or not. If she has had classified security briefings about this, then she is knowingly speculating about highly sensitive matters publicly in a counterproductive way for electoral benefit. And if she hasn't had classified briefings, then she's wildly speculating about matters in which she's uninformed. And both of those are dangerous and reflect poorly on her and on the opposition, who are again seeking to politicise a national security and foreign policy issue when our government, if we ever criticise the Labor Party's past standing on China or national security, is told that we're not allowed to politicise national security and foreign affairs. So that rule has to apply to everyone or no one.
Sure.
Look, it's a very serious challenge, and we are working at it. And we've had very good coverage from an intelligence point of view about China's plans and intentions. We have known for some time that they wanted to do this, but the difficulty that we have is that they don't play by the same rules that we are. We are constrained by our values, by our commitment to the rule of law and liberal democracy, and there are things which they are prepared to do which we would never do, and which we think in the long term are very harmful to their interests and harmful to the region. But in the short term, it can allow them to have some successes like this.
It was interesting when I visited the Solomon Islands at the end of 2019. It was just before the Solomon Islands government changed its recognition of China from Taiwan to mainland China, to PRC, and there were protests at the airport as we arrived, as the flight from Brisbane arrived. People holding up big placards saying they disagreed with the intentions of the government to change recognition. It's a hot issue in Solomon Islands, which I don't think is necessarily well understood in Australia. There's a complexity of views. They have their own really tricky domestic political environment, and of course, as you say, China plays by very different rules from us, and they don't have the transparency and accountability that a liberal democracy expects, taxpayers expect of the money that is spent in these countries. And it's just not Solomon Islands too, it's partners throughout the Pacific.
Exactly. And China has done a very good job of cultivating the political class in a lot of these countries, but actually is quite unpopular with the public in many of these countries. And that is a short-term political strategy, because these countries have elections and can make choices about their own future and can choose to vote for different governments with different policies if it's offered to them. So China's game, the way they operate in the Pacific, I think will ultimately be to their own detriment, but it may take some time for that to be revealed.
James, I wanted to shift our discussion to the Quad, which is been a long time coming and still probably hasn't quite come, but it certainly developed enormously since it was first discussed in 2006-07 and then put into abeyance when the Rudd government was elected. And I recall this intimately because I was serving as a diplomat in Japan from 2010 to 2014 and particularly with the election of the Abe government at the end of 2012. This is Abe 2.0. He'd been a real sort of promoter of the Quad, the security diamond of democracies. It's come into its own, but it's got its real challenges, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it is an evolving body, and it was wonderful that it was revived a few years ago at the foreign ministers level, and even better that it was upgraded recently to a leaders level dialogue and has now met a couple of times, including in person, which is quite a feat in a COVID pandemic. And there's another in-person meeting scheduled in Japan for just after our election, and that's a really positive thing. But real damage was done by the Rudd government's decision to walk away from it. As you know, it was deeply disappointing to India and Japan in particular, and a lot of trust has had to be rebuilt. But over the last few years, India has invited Australia again to participate in the Malabar Navy exercises, which is a really significant gesture, and we're working very well together. There is obviously a difference of opinion between India and Australia on when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, but we understand their perspective and we understand the unique history and the unique relationship that they have with Russia. And the Quad is really a dialogue which is focused on the Indo-Pacific. It is not a global security discussion forum. It is a Indo-Pacific forum. And on those issues, there really isn't a cigarette paper of difference separating us from India, Japan, or the United States. And the meeting held in Melbourne just a few months ago between the foreign ministers was extremely convivial and there's a high level of agreement. And it was a real gesture of significance that Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, came out to Australia for that dialogue in the lead up to the conflict of Ukraine, and then went to Fiji on the way afterwards on his way home, and the first Secretary of State to visit the Pacific in some time. So there is real buy-in and real commitment from the highest levels, and it's developing in a very positive way.
That's good to hear, and it's good to hear you think that the Indian government's stance on Russia over the Ukraine crisis is not an insurmountable challenge to the success of the Quad. What do you think of ideas like that mooted by Boris Johnson of a D21, I think it is, so a grouping of 21 democratic countries? Joe Biden, obviously, President Biden had his summit of democracies a little while back. That idea of building a coalition or an alliance, or sort of quasi-alliance of democracies. Yeah. I mean, it sounds pretty appealing to me, but it's tough when you've got the complexities of history, of the overlay of non-aligned movements, of post-colonial countries throughout our Indo-Pacific. How do we build on that idea, or is it not worth it?
I'm strongly supportive of closer coordination and cooperation from liberal democracies. I think there's much to be gained from that, and I know that our adversaries fear our ability to coordinate and work together, and I know they have been surprised at how successful we have been in response to Russia, in the way in which we've moved in such a united and rapid fashion to impose costs on Russia in terms of sanctions. That's been a really a big surprise, I think, even to us as well as to our adversaries. The only subtlety or nuance I would add to that is that Australia is in a region where there are many countries who we have to work with who are not democracies, but who actually do have a shared interest in upholding the sovereignty of states and self-determination, and we have to be willing and prepared to work with those states, even if they're not a perfect reflection of our values in terms of their own domestic situation. They can be quite important partners, and we don't have any ideological, filterological test that we apply to working with someone. If we have shared interests, we're happy to be pragmatic and work together.
And that's very Menzies, actually. His foreign policy was first and foremost about interests. And I always reflect on the great speeches of our time, of world leaders, leaders of the free world. They put a lot of emphasis in their speeches on values, but the actions are about fundamentally about interests. And you're who was it who said our interests are our values and our John McCain, God rest his soul, said our interests are our values and our values are our interests. It's true, but I think when I was having a a discussion with a former head of O&A, as it then was, Richard Maud, the other day, and he was talking about when you go to Southeast Asia, it's better to talk about principles, shared principles, rather than shared values, because shared values starts to sound a little bit like, the type of thing that the US, the UK and Australia talk about. What do you think about articulating things in terms of principles and interests? And
I think Richard's absolutely right about that, and we're not a country that seeks to impose our values on others, certainly not by force. We don't have the capacity to, nor the desire to, and we are genuinely willing to work with people even across differences. I think we've even demonstrated in the context of Australia's relationship with China. I mean, we know that China is not a democracy, and we know that it has a poor human rights record, but that didn't stop us achieving chapter. What has changed is China's approach to Australia, and that can't be ignored, and nor can we ignore what they've done in the South China Sea, nor should we ignore what they do in Hong Kong or their threats towards Taiwan, because they are very ominous indications of the direction that they're heading in and the way in which they will impact on our interests as well as our values.
On Taiwan, James, and I think this is a good note to finish on, how do you see Australia's role in any confrontation that may occur on Taiwan? It's an incredibly difficult question. It's totally hypothetical, so I'm not going to hold you to this. But we are talking about a separate nation, not of course recognised by the United Nations as a state. People who identify as an independent nation being taken over potentially by the PRC. Does Australia stand by and let it happen? We obviously are seeking to prevent it getting to that stage, but that's also putting Australia, like NATO is having this very, very, very big decision over what to do on Ukraine. How far does Australia go to defend another country's interests when its own direct interests aren't affected? Or is it about preventing a domino effect?
So very shortly after I was first elected, I visited Taiwan as part of a delegation. I met the president, Tsai Ing-wen, who's still the president today, a very impressive lady and a great leader. And I think there's a lot of commonality of interests and values with Taiwan. It's a liberal democracy island nation with mid-20 million population, as we are in the Pacific. And I think our interests are very intimately tied to theirs. I think it's critical that any resolution of cross-straits tension is done peacefully, and that any military attempt to change the status quo should be resisted, because it would have a massive destabilising effect for the whole region, for Japan, for Australia, for the Philippines, for Vietnam, Singapore, many others, and many would not welcome that. And I think the self-determination of the Taiwanese people has to be put at the heart of that resolution. They are a liberal democracy, and they can and should choose their own future, and they shouldn't be coerced into accepting a future that they don't want. And my read of it is they are more determined than ever before to assert that and to control that, and so they should. And so should we support them in that, and really do everything we can to deter China from trying to resolve this by military means. It's
pretty depressing, though, when you see how things unfolded in Hong Kong. There was an attempt by quite a few of the Hong Kong people to stand up to China changing the status quo there and introducing its national security law and the like, imposing its will on the Hong Kong people way before its treaty obligations allowed it to. We let it. We didn't do anything. We put out some press releases. There were no sanctions against China, as far as I recall. I mean, we've made a bit more of an effort against Russia with its invasion of Ukraine, and appreciate Hong Kong's place in international law is different from the Ukraine, but we're taking slightly inconsistent approaches. As a watcher of these things, I wonder how does it play out then when it comes to Taiwan, which also has its own unique history in relation to China, like Hong Kong.
You're right, and I am concerned that the lesson that China has taken out of Hong Kong is the wrong one, which is that the West would not resist in the event of invasion of Taiwan. They should know, as we do, that the policy of the United States government is strategic ambiguity, which is deliberately deliberately designed to deter them from resolving that militarily. And I think it would be an enormous mistake for them to believe that the United States is not serious about that. It goes back to the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 passed by Congress. There's very strong support for Taiwan in the administration and in the Congress in the US. And it would be very dangerous of China to make an assumption that the US is not serious about it. They've never taken the military option off the table in relation to Taiwan, whereas they clearly, it was never on the table in relation to Hong Kong, and they clearly took it off the table in relation to Ukraine. It's notable that they did so for Ukraine but have not done so for Taiwan, and I hope China heeds that message.
Well, I hope for the people of Taiwan that it does too, because they certainly have dropped the PRC has dropped any pretense of a charm offensive with Taiwan.
Yes. In an era of wolf warrior diplomacy, there's not much charm at all coming out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
The charmless offensive at the moment, I think. Well, James Paterson, thank you so much for your time today on the Afternoon Light podcast. It's been an absolute delight to talk about your work on the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, on AUKUS, the Quad, and all the geopolitical challenges of our time, of which there are so very many. And I appreciate you taking the time during your election campaign too. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Georgina. I really appreciate it.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.